available to us to in some way manage that risk. If I blow this up, what we see is when we determine potential risk treatment, which is anything that we can do to try to manage that risk back to a tolerable level, we don't have to just use controls. We could do other things. So we have actually 4 options available to us, and they're not mutually exclusive. We use a combination of them. The very first option that we use by default is risk retention. In other words, risk acceptance on ISACA's exam. You tend to accept the risk that you can, reduce the risk as much as possible, and oftentimes transfer the rest. I had a university professor once that said that is the art, accept, reduce, transfer, that is the art of risk management. Well, then we ended up introducing the other 4th option, risk avoidance, and that messes the whole neat art of risk management thing up. So, but nonetheless, we tend to assume as much risk, accept as much risk as we can without investing in controls and without disrupting operations. But if there's still risk left over, residual risk, we need to use the other options. Now, which ones are best? That's what takes some thinking. Now, typically what we will do is assume or accept as much risk as we can, but then we look and see, is there any way that we could re-engineer the process to avoid some risk? Maybe we don't need to, how's the video coming through? Is my video still coming through properly to everybody? In my own reflection, it looks like I'm frozen. Let me go ahead and refresh my browser and see if that helps. One moment. Taking it on. Accepted risk should be reviewed regularly to ensure that the initial risk acceptance rationale is still valid. Meaning on occasion, every now and then, the organization should periodically look at their finances and say, has our risk tolerance for financial risk changed since last year? We also look at that with compliance risk and the like. So, risk treatment number 2, we avoid risk. Again, whatever activity that we were doing that gave us exposure to the risk, we could terminate that activity, we could stop that activity, or reduce that activity, and it would lessen our risk. So, again, if you don't want to get hit by a car, don't go out on the road, for example. So, mitigating risk with controls. This is where we're actually reducing risk through controls by using, again, whether it be access controls or redundancy with for backups and things of this nature, to help us cost effectively reduce, avoid, and transfer risk. Okay, examples of mitigating controls that may come up on your exam. Anti-malware is a favorite. Anti-malware software characterized, they say, as risk mitigation. And again, because they say that the anti-malware software is not really doing a vulnerability assessment, it's actually, well, treating the threat itself. So it's reducing the capability of the threat. According to ISACA, anti-malware software, again, only reduces the impact of malware since it doesn't alter the number of threats that it exists. Interesting. That's their way to look at it, and that's how you'll have to memorize it for the exam. Again, the business case for controls really comes down to a return on investment. The idea is once you understand what the risk is potentially worth in impact, you can then see what it would cost to actually have the control to mitigate or reduce that risk. Well, a less fancy way of saying it that makes a lot of sense is we have to figure out what would it cost with no controls. That's the cost of doing it wrong. Figure out the cost of the controls themselves, and what would that be, the cost of doing it right? If the cost of doing it with controls is less than the cost of doing it wrong without controls, we should have the controls, is the idea. The controls bring net value. They bring more risk reduction than what they cost. Those are the controls we want to invest in. And that's what all of this is saying. The bulleted text is the way that ISACA might say it on your exam. Prioritizing response, again, we prioritize using various techniques, oftentimes using risk ranking, cost-benefit analysis. We learned that in the previous module yesterday. It's the manager's responsibility to decide the balance between implementing controls and budget assignment. Again, see me for a risk management class. We'll talk about that some more, but that's how ISACA has it on their exam. Again, going back to our fourth risk treatment option, to share or transfer the risk. You typically will hear it called transferring risk on ISACA's exam. Again, the idea is that we're going to transfer the risk to another party who can actually maybe more effectively manage that risk. We'll transfer perhaps to an insurer with an insurance policy. That is one method of handling risk. Take a look at that bottom bullet. Risk transfer or risk sharing is best suited for what kinds of risks? That risk that is characterized by low probability, meaning that it's not predictable, and with high impact, meaning very severe impact. So something that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's huge. That's the kind of risk that's very difficult to predict with accuracy because of its low probability. You know it's going to happen, you just don't know when. It might be once every 10 years, it might be once every 12, we don't know. But when it happens, it really, really hurts. Like a hurricane, for example. So those kinds of low frequency but high severity risk, those are more the kinds of risks that we would look to insurance to solve. So let's go ahead and take a look at a practice question real quickly. Patching vulnerabilities detected through regularly scanning web-facing applications. This is an example of what? Risk mitigation, risk avoidance, risk transfer, or risk acceptance. What do you think? Okay, so what do we have? First off, quick poll of the audience. Can people hear me okay? Just making sure that I haven't had another technical breakdown. Okay, good. Lindsay, thank you for your feedback. Okay, going ahead and moving forward. And you thanks for the compliment. We'll get video back, I promise. You'll see. So, wow, look at this. Again, we have the answer that people are choosing is risk mitigation. That is actually the answer. Again, we had a few people choosing risk avoidance. Well, again, risk avoidance is actually getting rid of the activity that puts you in front of the risk to begin with. And again, patching vulnerabilities, I can see how you would say, well, then you wouldn't have the risk, the exposure to the risk at all anymore. But again, that's really a control that we're doing. And to avoid risk, typically we would say, well, we would stop using that application perhaps that was vulnerable to begin with. So again, ISACA's feeling is it's risk mitigation, and it's their exam. So we go on into risk and control ownership. Again, this is going to feel a bit redundant, so we're going to pick up the pace a little bit. I'm sure that's just fine by you. We're looking at establishing risk ownership and accountability. We already know necessary for risk management program to be effective. Mapping identified risk to a specific business process. gives us the basis for establishing risk ownership. Because remember, the business process owner is accountable for that business process, and therefore risk to that business process is accountable to that business process owner. That's the idea. So again, business process owners are an effective starting point for conducting interviews to ensure that IT systems are meeting those business process owners' business process needs. Process owners, again, determine internal control requirements. And again, you're seeing this come over and over again because ISACA wants you to remember that business process owners, which are typically department heads, are risk owners for their business processes. So let's take a look at this. Again, what provides the basis for establishing risk ownership? Mapping controls administration to identified risk, the organizational chart, regulatory requirements, or mapping identified risk to a specific business process. You should know this one. Okay. We have 90% of the folks that actually, remembered it from the previous slides. Yes, mapping identified risk to a specific business process helps us identify risk ownership, because if we can see who owns the business process, we will then know who owns the risk to that business process. So now we head off into third-party risk management. Sometimes you'll hear this called external dependency management, but not on ISACA's exam. They call it third-party risk management. Again, we're now looking at different kinds of outsourcing. One of them might be for IT outsourcing. And again, we outsource because, it lets us utilize higher levels of subject matter expertise that we may not have the budget for to hire permanently. So we can hire specialty subject matter expertise and processes from the outside, and perhaps also take advantage of scale and efficiency. So what you need to remember for your exam, ensuring that outsourced activities provide that meaningful advantage to the organization is actually the most important primary concern when evaluating the organization's use of third-party services. Man, you can imagine how that might get a little bit difficult if they say, which is more important, making sure that you get meaningful advantage to the organization, or that the outsourcing is secure? She would say, I need both. Yes, but what is the better answer in ISACA's opinion? Again, leave your own opinions at home on exam day. They feel the most impactful, meaningful advantage to the organization, again, is what is going to be your primary concern. Again, looking at outsourcing, examples of outsourcing, just so you know: external outsourcing, internet service providers, communication companies, security firms, call centers. Internally, we might bring in contractors to help us with specialty needs with our IT and other things. And again, the idea is that we're going to get economies of scale since we can borrow those people for the little time that we need them instead of hiring them full time. That gives us some advantage. The disadvantage is that we lose control over our own information systems. The problem is that we have outsourced responsibility for managing them, and in the end of the day, we still retain the accountability for how well they do. So accountability for the corporate security policy is still kept within the organization, even if the organization outsources. We also have the disadvantage of potential vendor failure. The vendor could go bankrupt. The vendor could go out of business. So ISACA reminds us, and this is true, anything that is critical and core to your business should never be outsourced, regardless of monetary savings. Simply because it's a core process, and that's just simply too potentially risky, if you will, for potentially destroying the business. So Another example is if processing of EFT, electronic funds transfer, is outsourced to a third-party service provider in another country, what is your concern? Legal jurisdiction issues. That would be your answer. So, quick practice question, keeping you on your toes. If processing of EFT is outsourced to a third-party service provider, can you remember what I just said a moment ago? Is it reliability issues that we're concerned about, legal jurisdiction, performance issues, or cost benefit? They're all good concerns. What does ISACA feel is the most primary one? Okay, let's check it out. What did we? Legal jurisdiction issues, 100%. I am so proud. You folks are doing fantastic. Thanks. All right, so we move on. Issues, findings, and exceptions management. Making good progress. By the way, does this material feel just a little bit lighter than yesterday's? If so, it's really just because you've got a better handle on risk management. It's not that it's really that much easier. It just feels that way. Issues, findings, and exception management. So, action plans with deadlines need to be assigned to responsible personnel to ensure that appropriate mitigation occurs on identified systems vulnerabilities. We know that we need to have incident response plans, and that's what those action plans are. Moving on, the management of emerging risk. Emerging risk, again, significant changes in information security risk should be reported to senior management to enable them to have more educated decision making. We then go into, I warned you, by the way, that those sections were short, and they were short, weren't they? Just not a lot of weight on the exam, even though they were in the exam objectives. So going back again, we look at domain 3. We're going into risk response reporting. We continue on with section 2. Control design and implementation. We look at control types, standards, and frameworks. We look at control design, selection, and analysis. We look at control implementation. We look at control testing and effectiveness evaluation. So we move on to the first piece, the first topic of the second section of domain 3, control types, standards, and frameworks. Now, there isn't a lot of exam stuff on this slide, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you a little bit of a backgrounder on this. Essentially, you have program frameworks. You may remember yesterday, we worked to set up the risk management program that would then require and spec out how we do risk assessments. Okay, examples of program frameworks might include ISO 27001, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. For risk management, the program framework might be ISO 31000. Okay, the thing is when it actually gets down into the controls that are recommended, the best practices, the countermeasures for specific risks, we have controls frameworks. They don't really give us any help with governance, but they're really good with helping us determine better control objectives and better controls. Those are controls frameworks. Examples of those might be NIST 800-53, control objectives for information-related technology. You have another organization, Center for Internet Security, or CIS. They can give us control frameworks for our IT, for our enterprise, such as COVID, or even, well, our cyber controls, such as CIS controls. They tend to be very technical. I only do that because oftentimes we hear framework and program framework and programs and controls frameworks, and you start to wonder, what are the differences really? It's really macro to micro. Remember, program frameworks are more of the governance, whereas controls frameworks are the day-to-day practices and controls that we use to actually reduce risk. So, looking at these micro-level best practices, mitigating risk with controls, we understand that we use a control as a risk treatment to decrease our residual risk that we needed to get rid of because it's beyond our risk appetite. So remember, I'm just reinforcing from yesterday, according to ISACA, how many control methods are there? Technical and non-technical. If you see a control that is not one of those, it is not the right answer. So you can mark out answers that cannot be in ISACA's world. If they're not technical or non-technical, they're not a valid control. It's not something that ISACA understands. So technical could be including encryption, intrusion detection systems as examples of technical controls. Non-technical controls, this is where ISACA gets a little creative. Manufacturing procedures are operational non-technical controls. Enterprise security policies are non-technical management or managerial controls. Policies specifying permitted, non-permitted actions are examples of non-technical managerial controls. See, they kind of take some license and shifting it up as they go, but the one thing that remains constant, the controls will either be technical or non-technical. They won't be administrative. They won't be just physical. If it has technical, non-technical with it, it might be a possibility, but otherwise it's not. And you can cast those answers out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you narrow the answers to choose the right one that ISACA likes. So that way you too can be CRISC certified and admired by all of your friends, relatives, and pets. So going back to mitigating risk with controls. Again, controls are what we apply to a risk that will basically either affect the credibility or the strength of the threat. We can reduce the threat. We might reduce our vulnerability to a threat. We could correct the situation. Correct typically it means that, well, the incident's actually already started to happen, but we went ahead and had something that disconnected our system immediately if this was detected. It's a corrective control. So we have, again, corrective controls, compensating controls, preventive controls, impact minimizing controls, deterrent controls, detective controls, recovery controls, monitoring and awareness. You need to be aware of these different terms because they may have questions about what kind of control would this be. So we then move on, taking a look at what is an example of a compensating control. Well, an example would be one that's used to address the risk that a control might fail. And so we need to have another control that'll basically come in and resolve the issue anyway. It's a control that compensates for another control not achieving objective. Backup and restore procedures are often characterized as corrective controls. Why? Well, they didn't stop us from losing the first data, but they did at least allow us to bring the data back from a backup. So again, they didn't really address the risk itself. They really addressed the consequence. Control types, standards, and frameworks. Again, corrective controls remediate the impact from negative events. The principle of least privilege is practiced to reduce potential impacts of a malicious hacker who gains access to an administrator account. Again, what does this mean? Hey, even administrators shouldn't have any more access than what is required to do their job. And by using that principle, if a hacker does compromise an administrator account, they won't have as much power to do things because you have limited powers for your administrator accounts. Privileged user management is very important. So, control types, standards, and frameworks. We have an enterprise policy. This is an example of a non-technical directive control, right? You're getting the hang of it, that states the enterprise's directive related to risk management. Again, it's stating their intent of what they want. The supervisor's review of an enterprise's firewall logs is considered an administrative control, and it's a non-technical administrative control. Even though the firewall itself is technical, the logs are not technical. They are considered a non-technical administrative control. So, which of the following is used to address control risk itself, meaning the risk that a control may not work properly? Is it a corrective control, preventive control, compensating control, or detective control? Okay, let's see what we did. We have people choosing in large part, again, corrective, or rather compensating control, which is actually the answer. Again, it's compensating for the fact that the primary control didn't sufficiently control the risk. Detective control is what detects that something has happened. Preventive control is something that, well, prevents something from happening. By the way, preventive control could be, well, removing a vulnerability. That would prevent a risk from happening. We could also, again, add a control that prevents a threat from emerging, such as an intrusion correction, or rather, instead of an intrusion detection system, we have an intrusion prevention system, and that would be a preventative control. So, we now move on to control design, selection, and analysis. Evaluating controls, we look at prioritizing, addressing risk in line with a risk treatment strategy. That's what ISACA prefers as a cost-effective risk response. What do they mean by prioritizing, addressing risk in line with a risk treatment strategy? They mean that you're going to address the most critical risk before you address the least critical risk. That's prioritization, which equates to cost-effective risk response. Cost-benefit analysis is typically performed in the context of risk response planning and control selection. I told you before, we have to determine what gives us the most net value. How much risk does it reduce for how much we had to spend? It's about return on investment. So prioritizing and selecting effective risk mitigation, again, examining things we need to remember. Stakeholder requirements are typically the most important consideration when we look at our information systems controls in a complex environment. We need to have security technologies selected according to their ability to mitigate risk. Most importantly, to support organizational objectives. Remember, that is the overall theme, the guiding light to all of our answers. What are used to prioritize risk for treatment? They say risk ratings, low, medium, and high. Again, the idea going back to, let's address the most significant risk first before we address the risks that don't really impact us much. So, control design, selection, analysis, again, to evaluate effectiveness of risk mitigation. Again, we take a look at the current state of our existing controls and identify that. Controls are considered to be most effective when they are designed to reduce vulnerabilities. Interesting. So, in other words, ISACA seems to have a preference for reducing vulnerabilities rather than crisis managing with managing our threats. In reality, we want to do both, but on your exam day, managing vulnerabilities evidently has more value than managing threats. Interesting. It's ISACA's exam. Don't shoot the messenger. So, implementing role-based access controls, this helps us reduce the probability of an impact of an insider attack event. It's a very long and fancy way of saying, by managing your user access and user privilege as well, you probably won't have as likely a problem or as severe a problem with an insider attack. They have a long, cumbersome way of saying it, but that's how you might expect it on exam day. Compensating controls, again, those are the controls that, well, come in when the other control didn't get the job done. They are deployed to mitigate control risk of primary controls. We already get that. We're masters of that. We already understand that. And again, controls are most effective when they are designed to reduce what? Vulnerabilities, threats, impacts, or consequences. You should know this right off the bat. Vulnerabilities. This is true. Remember, rote memorization is your friend in this exam. I told you it's arguable as to what you want to reduce, the threats or the vulnerabilities, or perhaps the overall impact, the consequence of the event. Doesn't really matter how we argue it. In the end of the day, ISACA is always right on their own exam, and they think that vulnerabilities are the best thing and the most effective thing to reduce when controlling risk. It's their test. Answer it their way. It's the best way. Control implementation. We move on. Control implementation, again, just best practices that ISACA wants you to know for your exam. Controls are used to reduce residual risk. We already knew that. Residual risk, again, was that risk that was beyond our risk appetite, beyond our risk acceptance. We need to use controls to reduce that risk back to within tolerance, back to within acceptance. So, unjustified controls typically reduce return on investment. How bizarre is this? We know that we justify controls because they bring positive return on investment. So I guess ISACA decided, well, if that's true, they could make a mirror of that question and say that means that unjustified controls reduce ROI. It's the opposite. That's true. Okay. At least it's consistent with the other question. Controls should be selected based on their ability to reduce business risk, but again, at acceptable cost. What is an acceptable cost? A cost that's less than what the risk would be without the control. That's what it is. That's return on investment, right? So we now look at, again, control implementation. Once a new control has been implemented to mitigate a previously identified risk, well, then we have to test the control to see if it actually accomplished goal. Calculating the benefits realized from the implementation of that control can be difficult because sometimes benefits are both tangible as well as intangible. So, practice question, what should be performed immediately after changes to ICT infrastructure? Yeah, if you didn't see this on the slide, this is just to kind of twist it up and challenge you a bit. What do we need to perform immediately after changes to ICT infrastructure? Approval for the ICT changes should be obtained and recorded. The ICT changes should be reported to designated systems owners. The changes should be tested for functionality, or should we simply perform a penetration test? What do you think? Okay, let's go ahead and find out how we did on this one. Changes to the ICT infrastructure. The changes should be tested for functionality is what most people chose. That's because they're thinking about it from an IT manager's perspective. However, this is, again, a risk management exam. They're not talking about changes to the controls themselves. They're talking about changes to the system. And you may remember, we're concerned that any changes to the system may have introduced new vulnerabilities. And if it potentially introduced new vulnerabilities, we need to check that and test for it with a penetration test, which tests for vulnerabilities. That is the correct answer, is penetration tests. So we move on, control testing. By the way, if you say, I still don't really agree with this one, that's okay. Just memorize it for your exam. It'll be in your practice questions. So, by the way, I saw a lot of folks signed up for the practice questions yesterday. Good job there. Again, the cost is right. May as well do it. Why not? Control testing and effectiveness evaluation. Now, again, control testing is actually also covered in depth, much more in depth, in information security in the next domain in the systems development lifecycle topic. So we're going to kind of skate through it a little bit here. We'll cover it more in depth there because there's just no sense in covering it in depth twice. Controlled testing and effectiveness evaluation, just best practices to memorize for the exam. How well the control works. If it accomplishes goal, the control objective, it's verified by testing its ability to achieve that control, and that the control is tested to see if it achieves its control objective, and then we would know it was effective. Information systems controls, again, are regularly tested to identify any potential design flaws, failures, redundancies, but that's where we find out whether or not the control doesn't work and why. Performing periodic penetration testing helps us ensure that a corporate network is still adequately secured against external attack, because that's a type of vulnerability assessment. Again, control testing is what helps us determine the effectiveness of controls. We already get that. We already talked about it. This is just a little different way of saying it. Vulnerability scans, like a penetration test, are more practical, they say, than penetration testing. But wait a minute. Earlier they said penetration testing is testing for vulnerabilities. Welcome to ISACA's testing world. For those of you that felt like you ran into contradictions before, but you thought maybe you were crazy, you weren't. Ladies and gentlemen, these two starred points are both potentially on the same exam. So going back, by the way, don't get mad at me. Again, I don't like teaching it that way either, but if it helps you pass the test, that's what this course is about. It's not about being right, it's about being CRISC certified. So, control effectiveness is verified by what? Okay, let's see how we did. Testing its ability to achieve its control objective. All of these answers sound wonderful, they do. But ISACA feels, again, the best way to attest the effectiveness of a control is to see if it actually accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. And you could say, Alan, that's just a different way of testing its ability to function as designed. Well, functioning as designed is one thing. Was the design good enough to actually achieve objective is a different thing. So, again, a control could be functioning as designed, but the control, even functioning as designed, wasn't sufficient to really reduce the risk enough. So it's really measured against its control objective, and that is the correct answer. So we now go on into, again, another section. This particular domain, again, normally these CRISC exam domains only have 2 sections. This particular domain has 3. And we are now going into section 3, risk monitoring and reporting. We will look at risk treatment plans. We'll continue on with data collection, aggregation, analysis, and validation. And by the way, just so you know, we're going, once we